Hello, I am Andrew Peña, and let me talk to you about measuring ethnolinguistic vitality. Measuring ethnolinguistic vitality. Ethnolinguistic vitality can be defined in two ways. First, it could be the probability that a group of speakers will continue to speak the language associated with their group. This is also known as language vitality. A more technical definition of ethnolinguistic vitality comes from Giles, Boris, and Taylor. It's that which makes a group likely to behave as a distinctive and active collective entity in intergroup situations. In other words, how will the group behave when they are with other speakers? So that's what we're going to measure. There are different scales for measuring ethnolinguistic vitality. The classic one was by Joshua Fishman. It's called the Graded Intergenerational Transmission Disruption Scale, or GIDS. It's analogous to the Richter scale, which measures disruption of the stability of the Earth's crust. In other words, it measures earthquakes. The higher the intensity, the higher the disruption in the stability of the Earth's crust. In the GIDS by Fishman, the higher the score, the worse the disruption is of the transmission of a language from the older generation to the younger generation. Another one is the expanded graded intergenerational transmission disruption scale, or eGIDS. Still another one is language vitality and endangerment. Another one is indicators of ethnolinguistic vitality. And finally, we will discuss language endangerment index. The GIDS. Well, the GIDS was developed by Joshua Fishman. It has 8 levels. From level 8 to level 6, the scale is dependent on the age of the speakers. From there on, the measurement is based on the domains of language use. We will discuss the GIDS along with the eGIDS. Expanded graded intergenerational transmission disruption scale is an update on the GIDS. It's an expansion on Fishman's graded intergenerational transmission disruption scale by Paul Lewis and Gary Simons in 2013. It's based on the uses or domains of a language, as well as the age of the users of a language. It's based on the new reality that language exists in a language ecology composed of many languages. As I said, the proponents are Paul Lewis and Gary Simons. So let's talk about the GIDS and the eGIDS. As I said, the eGIDS is an expansion on the GIDS. The eGIDS can be used for measuring all languages, including international languages, whereas the GIDS is focused more on minority languages. So the level 0 in the eGIDS is international. This means the language is widely used between nations in trade, knowledge exchange, and international policy. Examples of this, of course, would be English, Chinese, Russian, Spanish. At level 1 in the GIDS, it's higher in number, but worse in disruption. So in the GIDS, indicates that there is some use of the language in higher level educational, occupational, governmental, and media efforts, but without the additional safety provided by political independence. In other words, the language, the people who speak the language are not independent politically, they're controlled by a higher political power. So you can see here, this is not about a national language. But in the eGIDS, level 1 is national. The language is in education, work, mass media, and government at the national level. So only a national language would attain something like that. At level 2, the language the language is used in lower governmental services and mass media, but not in the higher spheres of either of them. So that's level 2 in GIDS. In level 2 of eGIDS, the language is considered provincial. So if at level 1 you have a national language, level 2 means the language is provincial, meaning the language is in education, work, mass media, and government within major administrative subdivisions of a nation. At number 3, the GIDS describe the language as it's being used in the lower work sphere, outside of the language or neighborhood or community, involving interaction between in-group and out-group. So the language is used by people who do not consider it as their own language, but they use it anyway. For the eGIDS, this is much more clarified. The language is described as a language of wider communication because the language is used in work and mass media, but without official status, but it transcends language differences across a region. So the language is not provincial because it's not used at the government, in the government, but it's used unofficially to communicate with people from different groups. At level 4, the GIDS talks about the use of the language in lower education that meets the requirements of compulsory education laws. So the language is used in lower education, probably at the primary level, and there is a law requiring the use of that language in a particular level of education. The eGIDS clarifies this as the level at which a language is educational, meaning the language is in vigorous use with standardization and literature being sustained through a widespread system of institutionally supported education. So at level 4, the crucial requirement, the basic requirement is that the language is in vigorous use. And then there's standardization of literature, and that literature is sustained because there's a widespread system of institutionally supported education. The difference of this is the use of the word standardization and the requirement that the language is in vigorous use. So it's possible that the language is in lower education, it meets the requirements of compulsory education laws, but there's some possibility that the language is not in vigorous use. So that is clarified by the eGIDS. At level 5, the GIDS talks about literacy in the language in home, school, and community, but without taking on extra communal reinforcement of such literacy. So in other words, according to the GIDS, at level 5, the language is being written, it's used at home, school, and community, but there is no law, there's no support from outside of the community. Number 5 for the eGIDS, it's labeled as developing. The language is in vigorous use. That's another requirement. It's a basic requirement. The language is in vigorous use. With literature in a standard form being used by some, though this is not yet widespread or sustainable. At level 4 and at level 5, it is crucial that the language is in vigorous use because some people who measure ethnolinguistic vitality make the mistake that just because there's literature in a language or there's literature being developed in a language, they already put it at number 5. But there are cases when there's literature being developed in a language, but the language is not in vigorous use. So for a language to be at level 5, all the requirements in the description should be met, particularly that the language is in vigorous use. Number 6, this is according to Fishman, this is where many of the rigorous languages are. This is the attainment of intergenerational informal oral C and its demographic concentration and institutional reinforcement. So there are 3 requirements. There's the language is being used across generations. There's demographic concentration, meaning the speakers are together. And there's institutional reinforcement, meaning the language is supported institutionally. That's quite a requirement. So the eGIDS divided that into 6A and 6B. 6A is the language is vigorous, meaning the language is used for face-to-face communication by all generations, and the situation is sustainable, meaning it's being passed on to the next generation. However, it's possible that a language is used for face-to-face communication within all generations, but it is losing a significant number of users. Okay, it's possible that the language is being used for face-to-face communication. That's what is common in 6A and 6B. But in 6A, the situation is sustainable. There's a lot of young people learning the language. But in 6B, there's a significant number of young people who are not using the language anymore. Level 7, there's greater disruption. For the GIDS, it's described as most users of the language are socially integrated and ethnolinguistically active population, but they are beyond childbearing age. The ones using the language are using it, but they are beyond childbearing age. Now, it's still possible that the language is being used by older people. They're beyond childbearing age, but they still transmit it to children who are not their children. So that's clarified in level 7 of the eGIDS. The language is described as shifting, meaning the childbearing generation can use the language among themselves, but it is not being transmitted to children. So there, it's clarified. The crucial element is that the language is not being transmitted to children. It's clarified by the eGIDS. At level 8 is the worst for the eGIDS, for the GIDS. In this case, most vestigial users, meaning old users of the language, are socially isolated old folks, and the language needs to be reassembled from their mouths and memories and taught to demographically unconcentrated adults, something which I'm not sure if it's been done before. For the eGIDS, it's divided into 2. 8A is moribund. The language is moribund, meaning The only remaining active users of the language are members of the grandparent generation and older. Only older people are using it, but there's still a possibility that it would be learned. But in 8B, the language is nearly extinct. The only remaining users of the language are members of the grandparent generation or older, and they have little opportunity to use the language. Maybe because there are only a few of them and they don't meet each other. They don't interact with each other. Okay, in 8A, the language is moribund. Maybe there's still some possibility that the users are using them with each other. But in 8B, nearly extinct, the older people who speak the language have very little opportunity to use the language because they are isolated from each other, probably. Now, the GIDS ends with 8, but the eGIDS continues. At number 9, the language is described as dormant, meaning the language serves as a reminder of the heritage identity for an ethnic community, but no one has more than symbolic proficiency. So this is largely true of Hebrew at one time. It was dormant. Much of the use for Hebrew was symbolic. But there was a chance that it would be revived, and Hebrew was indeed revived. Level 10 of the eGIDS, the language is no longer used and no one retains a sense of ethnic identity associated with the language. So at level 9, there's still a connection between an ethnic community and the language. But in 10, there's no connection. The language is dead and there's no more connection between between the language and ethnic identity. Now, the thing about the eGIDS is that Paul Lewis and Gary Simons published a book, Sustaining Language Use, which talks about their model of language, the sustainable use model. So the eGIDS is part of the model of language use devised by Lewis and Simons. So the eGIDS is just part of the SUM or sustainable use model. And that model is described in their book. Their book describes everything that you need to know in order to conduct a useful survey of a language, as well as a way to help the language to become sustainable. That's why it's called sustainable use model. So that is the eGIDS. Let's continue with the indicators of ethnolinguistic vitality by Lynn, Landweer. The indicators of ethnolinguistic vitality was originally formulated by Lynn Landweer for comparing the ethnolinguistic vitality of languages in Papua New Guinea in order to determine which language to prioritize for development. So there are so many languages in Papua New Guinea, and language developers, people involved in language development, need to find out which language to prioritize. Now, this is done by adding scores given for each indicator and determining the status of the language. So each language will have a score, and those scores will be compared with each other. And of course, the languages that meet a particular score will be prioritized. The ones with better scores than others, that is higher scores than others, will be prioritized. So the indicators of ethnolinguistic vitality are composed of several indicators, and each indicator has a particular level. So the indicators of ethnolinguistic vitality are eight. One is the position of the speech community on the remote urban continuum or rural urban continuum. The second indicator would be the domains in which the target language is used. Number three, the third indicator is frequency and type of code switching. The fourth indicator is population and group dynamics. The fifth indicator is distribution of speakers within their own social network. The sixth indicator is the social outlook regarding and within the speech community. Number seven, indicator number seven is language prestige. And indicator number eight is access to a stable and acceptable economic base. So let's talk about the position of the speech community on the remote or rural and urban continuum. The highest score is 3, and it's described as remote access to or movement from nearest urban or expat population center is difficult and limited. In other words, the speakers of that language could not go to an urban area, and they find it difficult to move outside areas of their own language. The second highest score of 2 is there's marginal access to and movement from the nearest urban or expat population center, meaning the speakers could access the urban areas, the towns, for example, but it's quite difficult. Number one, the speakers have fairly easy access to and movement from the nearest urban place. And a 0 is when the speech community is located within urban district or confines of expatriate population center. In other words, the more contact the speech community has with other speakers, the worse for them. The less frequent the contact, the better. The more isolated the language speakers are, the better for their language. Okay, that's according to this indicator. Second indicator would be the domains in which a target language is used. You're probably very familiar with this. The highest score is the targeted language is the language of choice in the home and during all cultural and social events. Social meaning when people talk with each other in any situation. Cultural events could include rituals and other activities related to the culture. Score of 2 would be given if the target language is the language of choice in the home and within cultural events, but where the communication within social events mixes it with the lingua franca or with other languages. So it's used, but the language is mixed with other languages. A score of 1 to be given if the target language is the language of choice in the home, but where both cultural events and social events mix it with the lingua franca or other local languages. So people who speak this language would use it at home, but when they go out for social and cultural events, there's mixture with another language. And a score of 0 would be given if the target language is mixed with the lingua franca or other languages in every domain across society, including the home environment. So if even at the home, the language itself is not the only language used, then the score is 0. There's also the indicator involving frequency and type of code switching. Code switching is when a speaker changes from one language to another, either between sentences or within a sentence. A score of 3 would be given to a monolingual allegiance to the vernacular among the majority, meaning majority of the speakers do not code switch, do not shift to another language, do not change from one language to another when they're talking. 402, if there is evidence of a diagnostic or a stable bilingual situation, meaning the languages are used in specific domains. So maybe for the office, this language is used, but at home, that language is used. For this particular domain, this language is used, but for that domain, this language is used. So there's still some sort of code switching, but it's more at the domains. It's determined by the domain. The shift is, that switch is determined by the domain. Or of number one would be infrequent individual unbounded lexical code switching, meaning there's some code switching that happens. There's no explanation, there's no basis for why individuals would switch from one language to another, but that is infrequent. And if there's frequent individual unbounded code switching, meaning speakers keep on switching from one language to another, mixing words from both languages, then the score is 0. In other words, the less code switching, the better. Then there is population and group dynamics. This has to do with immigrants. A score of 3 would be given to the language if the immigrants, people who go into the speech community, are actively bilingual, meaning they learn to speak the vernacular of their adopted home. So whenever some people outside of the speech community would go into the speech community, they learn the language, they speak the language of the speech community there. That's score of 3. A score of 2 would be given if the immigrants are passively bilingual, meaning they understand the vernacular, but they respond using another language. So they speak another language, but they can understand the vernacular of the speech community. Score of 1 would be given if the immigrants require two-way communication entirely through a lingua franca or trade language, when immigrants insist that they don't use the language of the speech community, rather they use another language in communication. They insist that there's two-way communication. They speak it and people also speak it to them. And the language gets a score of 0 if the immigrants maintain their own language and insist that others in the adopted home learn to speak that language for communication with them. Okay, they even force the speakers of the speech community to learn the new language. Okay, in other words, the more speakers, the better. Okay, so when immigrants also learn the language, that's better. That's population and group dynamics. And then another indicator is the distribution of speakers within their own social network. This has to do with relationships. Okay, a score of 3 would be given to cross-cultural independence, intra-community interdependence, with dense multiplex networks utilizing the target language to meet communication needs. When you say multiplex network, it means that the people that a person knows also know each other. They have a relationship with others. So the people that you know also have a relationship with each other. When we say dense network, it means that people are related to each other in more than one way. Okay, for example, you have a person She is your aunt, and she is also your godmother. That's dense network. Now, if you know two people, and those two people are also related to each other, then that's multiplex. Okay, so that's a score of 3. Then, for a score of 2 is cross-cultural interdependence, meaning there's a divided network system, internally dense and with a degree of multiplexity attenuated by the necessity to communicate with outsiders for some goods and services. Meaning, you do have dense relationships. You're related to people who speak that language in more than one way. And the people who speak that language know each other, but they have relationships with other people. And in that relationship, they need to use another language in order to attain services and goods. Okay, so for example, there are people in the community that you need to speak with using another language. You're related to them, but you have to use another language in speaking to them. 4 of 1 is given if there's cross-cultural dependence, meaning there's a divided network system. There's internal density. However, the necessity to communicate with outsiders for all goods and services. All the goods and services that you need, in order to attain them, you need to communicate with outsiders. Meaning, in order to get the goods that you need, the services that you need to speak another language. Then a score of 0 is given if there's individual independence, meaning there's sparse network, few to nil repetitive social connections supportive of the vernacular. There's not many relationships that support the language. There's not many relationships in which you use the language being talked about. Rather, in the relationships that you have to use another language. In other words, the tighter the social structure where the vernacular is the language of choice, the better. So as I said, it's all about relationships. If the people you relate to speak the language, that's better. If the people you have to relate to, you need to speak to them in another language, then that's not supportive of the language. Then there is social outlook regarding and within the speech community. This has to do with status. The question is there internal or external recognition of the language community as separate and unique within the broader society? Is there material or non-material evidence of a situation, of a distinction? As I said, it's ethnolinguistic vitality, not just language. So for a score of 3, it would be given if there's strong internal identity, people consider themselves as a separate people group, and there's high status or even authority conferred by outsiders, meaning outsiders think of this people group as being distinct, whether positive or negative, and there are cultural markers present, meaning there are icons, there are markers that identify that particular group as being distinct. 4 of 2 is given if there's strong internal identity, but there's neutral status conferred by outsiders with cultural markers present, meaning the status is just okay. It's the people group are not of particular remarkability. They're not remarkable. They're not considered very different, although there are some cultural markers that are present. 4 of 1 would be given if there's weak internal identity, neutral status conferred by outsiders with some cultural markers present, meaning the people group are not so, they don't identify, they don't distinguish themselves very much from other speakers, and they are not considered remarkable by outsiders. They're not recognized very much as a distinct people group. And there are some cultural markers present. And of course, a zero score would be given to weak internal identity, negative status conferred by outsiders, with few, if any, cultural markers present. So when the community is looked down, there are not so many cultural markers, meaning whatever cultural items the each community has, they borrow from others, and they don't consider themselves very different from others. Then a score of zero is given. Then there is language prestige. A score of three is given if the language in question is a prestigious, nationally recognized lingua franca. Score of two if the language in question is a regionally recognized lingua franca, maybe a language in church or education and or a trade language. A score of one is given if the language in question is a locally recognized variety with neutral status. It's just the same as the other languages. Score of zero if the language is a locally disparate variety. People look down on the language. Okay, the other indicator has to do with the ethnicity of the speakers, the reputation of the speakers. This one is all about the language. And then there is access to a stable and acceptable economic base, meaning, is there an acceptable economic base supportive of continuing use of the target language? Is there a job or a livelihood where you have to use the language? That's the question. Number three, a score of three is given if there's stable and acceptable economic base where the target language is the code of choice. For example, in the case of the Manide of Camarines Norte, the men engage in copra, and they do not work with outsiders. They work only among themselves, which means that if somebody would work with them, would engage in that livelihood, they have to speak the language of the Manide. So the economic livelihood is supportive of the language. Number two, a score of two is given if there's adequate dual economy where the language used is dictated by choice of economic base, meaning there are many options, and in one option you have to use the language. In another option, you don't need to use the language. Number one, a score of one is given if there's marginal subsistence economy requiring augmentation of the traditional means of subsistence with cash-based economic schemes requiring use of a language other than the target language. Case in point of this is the Kasiguran Agta. They used to be hunters and gatherers, and so they use their own language, but now they have to rent themselves with others. They involve in what is called tenured labor. They have to engage in labor where they have to be paid, where they get paid, but they have to use another language because the person they're working for speaks not their language but another language. So in addition to hunting and gathering, they have to become rented workers, laborers. Okay, and when they're laborers, they need to speak another language because the person giving their salary, the person they work for, speaks another language. And a score of zero if there's dependence on an economic system requiring use of the languages other than the target language. So I hope the Kasiguran Agta still have some opportunity for hunting and gathering. Otherwise, they would have to work in order to get cash. They would have to work with outsiders, where they have to use the language of the outside. Now, The thing about this scale is that all the scores are the same, meaning there's no weight. For example, I would think that having a core group of speakers and access to a stable and acceptable economic base would be very important factors. But the scores that they have is the same as language prestige. And I believe that language prestige is not as strong as having a stable and acceptable economic base. Even if the language is disparate, but when you work, you have to use your language, then uh, that's a high plus for using the language. And yet, in this indicator, they have the same score. So maybe that could be considered. Now, this is how it's measured. If the score for the language is from 19 to 24, then the language is vital. If the score is 13 to 18, there's change in process, meaning the language is changing. There's some shifting going on. A score of 7 to 12 means there's radical shift in process. The language is shifting. It might die out in the next generation. And a score of 0 to 6 would mean that the language is already dying. Okay, so these are the explanation of the scores. But the use of the indicators of ethnolinguistic vitality is more on comparing languages and which one to prioritize, as in the case of Papua New Guinea. Okay, so this is the indicators of ethnolinguistic vitality by Lynn Landweer. Okay, let's now talk about the scale called language vitality and endangerment. Language vitality and endangerment, or LVE, was formulated by many language experts all over the world under UNESCO. So this is considered the UNESCO scale for language vitality. It involves 9 factors with scores for each. So it's similar to the scale of Lynn Landweer, the indicators of ethnolinguistic vitality. Now, experts caution against simple addition of scores. So unlike the indicators of ethnolinguistic vitality by Emmeline Landweer, experts caution against simple addition of scores because for each situation, for each language, the factors may not be of the same weight. That's a consideration by the expert. Now, in the case of Emmeline Landweer's indicators of ethnolinguistic vitality, the situation is it's just Papua New Guinea, so the languages may have the same or very similar factors, and it's all about comparing the languages. And that's not the case with the UNESCO. It's wider in scope because it's the UNESCO. Now, according to the experts, they have to be customized. Now, the LVE is very complicated. It's very difficult to use. And there are so many factors, 9 factors. I will just give an example factor. Okay, let me mention the factors. Number 1 is intergenerational language transmission. Second factor, absolute number of speakers. Third factor, proportion of speakers within the total population. Factor 4, shifts in domains of language use. Factor 5, response to new domains and media. Factor 6, availability of materials for language education and literacy. Factor 7, governmental and institutional language attitudes and policies, including official status and use. 8 factor, community members' attitudes toward their own language. And number 9, amount and quality of documentation. Notice that these are very comprehensive factors because these are combined. These are the combined minds of language experts throughout the world. Let me just give you sample factor. Example, factor 6. Factor 6 has to do with availability of materials for language education and literacy. That is factor number 6. The score of 5 is given if there is an established orthography, there's literacy tradition with grammars, dictionaries, text, literature, and everyday media. And writing in the language is used in administration and education. So if the language meets that, it's given a score of 5. Score of 4 is given if written materials exist, and at school, children are developing literacy in the language. Writing in the language is not used in administration, however. Number 3, a score of 3 is given if written materials exist and children may be exposed to the written form at school, but literacy is not promoted through print media. Score of 2 is given if written materials exist, but they may only be useful for some members of the community. And for others, they may have a symbolic significance. And literacy education in the language is not a part of the school curriculum. Score of 5 is given if there's a practical orthography known to the community and some material is being given. Score of 0 if the language is not written, if no orthography is available to the community. Notice that this factor may not be very crucial because it's possible that the language has no written form and yet it's vigorously used. Okay, that's why the experts of the UNESCO caution against simple addition of factors. Notice also that the factors described here are very complicated. It's difficult to create a survey material, a questionnaire, a bunch of questions based on this scale. Okay, so it's not used very much directly, but it's used as reference. Maybe some surveyors would only use a particular factor, not all of the factors. Okay, so that is the case of the language vitality and endangerment scale. It's very comprehensive, very insightful, but very difficult to use. So it's customized, which is exactly what the experts would like us to do, customize it. Let's now talk about the Language Endangerment Index. The Language Endangerment Index is used by the Endangered Languages Project, powered by Google, and uses a catalog of endangered languages called the LCAT. The purpose of this is to assess a language even with very little information available. So this is a quick way of gauging and assessing language endangerment. As a quick way of measuring ethnolinguistic vitality, it uses only 4 parameters, what are considered to be the most important, most common, most useful parameters or indicators of ethnolinguistic vitality. And these are the absolute number of speakers, intergenerational transmission, trends in the number of speakers, and decrease in domains of use. Remember, the Language Endangerment Index uses only 4 parameters or indicators. Each parameter can have a score of 5 points, except the intergenerational transmission parameter, which can have up to 10 points. Okay, let me just give an example of the parameters. Absolute number of speakers. You would have a score, a description, and a criteria. So if the speakers are 100,000 or more, the language is described as safe and it's given a score of 0. The language is given a score of 1 if there are 10,000 to 999,999 speakers. The language is described as being vulnerable. If the language has a number of speakers ranging from 1,000 to 9,999, then it's considered threatened and it's given a score of 2. A score of 3 is given, and the language is described as moderately endangered if there are only 100 to 999 speakers. And the language is considered severely endangered if there are only 10 to 99 speakers, and there's still a score of 4. Now, a score is divided by 25 to produce a percentage. Okay, a score is divided by 25 to produce a percentage. And it's also allowed to have no data for a particular parameter. You just adjust. The interpretation of the percentages is if the percentage is from 81 to 100 or 100 down to 81, it's considered critically endangered. If the percentage is from 80 down to 61%, it's severely endangered. And if the percentage is 60 to 41%, the language is considered endangered. A percentage of 40 down to 21 would mean that the language is threatened, and a percentage of 20 to 1 would mean percent would mean the language is vulnerable. Now, a percentage of 0 would mean that the language is safe. Now, a score has a certainty value computed by giving 5 points to any parameter having data. Certainty value. Now, this is except for the case of intergenerational transmission, considered to be the most important parameter. It could have a score of 10 points. It could have a certainty value of 10 points. Now, these are the possible certainty level. 25 points possible, meaning the factor is very certain. It's 25 because there are 4 factors. 3 of them can have a maximum of 5, so 3 times 5 is 15. One factor can have the high score as 10, so 10 plus 15 is 25. So that's the highest point possible. That's the highest certainty level. 20 points would mean the factor is mostly certain. A score of 15 points, fairly certain. 10 points possible would mean the parameter is mostly uncertain, and 5 points possible, the parameter is uncertain. Thank you very much. These are the ways of measuring ethnolinguistic vitality.